So I guess I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I approach the idea of queering nature and then ask that question to all of these panelists because you can interpret it in so many different ways. I wrote a book called How Far the Light Reaches, A Life in 10 Sea Creatures, which is a memoir told through 10 sea creatures. And I'm a science writer by day, so the way that I approach queering nature or queer ecology is really thinking about biological exuberance. Historically, Western science has really tried to slot nature into rigid binaries between human and nature and natural and unnatural, but obviously the natural world is very complicated and messy and very fabulously queer. There are fungi with thousands of sexes. There are fish that transition sex over the course of their lives. There are so many gay penguins that now it's like, if you're not a gay penguin, like, what are you doing? So that is sort of how I approach queering nature and think about it. But I would love to hear from all of you how you think about queering nature in your own practice. And you can feel free to respond in any order.
Okay, I can go. So as I mentioned, I'm a mycologist. So I've been studying fungi for. I guess I don't like fungi because that's like the British way of saying it. Yeah, and I don't like British stuff. But anyway, so that's the only one I might be a little judgy about. But I've been studying fungi for about 15 years, and I ended up, sort of encountering them as organisms that felt, I think my initial draw towards these organisms was that they felt like kin. They felt familiar. They felt safe to me in this way. So I've always sort of found companionship in organisms maligned since childhood. And I know there's some questions about youth and coming up, so I won't get too into that. But my earliest connections with organisms were really like snakes and swamp creatures and organisms that sort of made me feel like I could be my full self as a child, sort of experiencing the world in this complicated way, experiencing pretty intense gender dysmorphia and sort of just the complicated sort of unclear identities that I have. So for me, there was always this this like linkage between my science and this emotional part of myself. And so many scientists talk about, objectivity as a motivating factor in studying organisms. But for me, it was like almost like the opposite of that. It was more of like almost a romantic experience to be with these organisms that felt that they were showing me that, like, diversity in nature is not just possible, but it's the abundance. It's the diversity is sort of like a function of ecological systems, right? That community is built through transactions between beings that are not quite the same, and you could see all of these ways in which you can sort of find modes of expression that were subversive and not quite what you expected. So for me, there was this sort of early grappling with like this feeling of community with organisms that fell outside of the binary. And fungi were like that in a pretty like explicit way, being like that they're literally queer in many regards, but also that they were marginalized by Western scientific thought for hundreds of years. So there was this sort of direct queerness in their biology, but then there was also this sort of way in which they were regarded as these inferior beings for the majority of Western scientific thought. So they're understudied, they've been neglected, and there's very material sort of ramifications to this, right? We know very little about the fungal community because they've been excluded from formal scientific thought and funding and research programs, and that has like very clear sort of philosophical roots in all sorts of sort of Western cultural norms and normativity. So there was this other element to it that also, once I started studying mycology more, I started to realize that, there was so much we didn't know, and that wasn't actually totally accidental, right? That there are all these sort of cultural fingerprints in science and affecting the way we actually are interfacing with the world and affecting the way we're producing knowledge, right? So there was this abstract sort of like way in which the ways fungi were subverting sort of expectations of what was normal, made them organisms that were neglected by science. So I'm sure we'll get more into that, but yeah.
Yeah. I also just wanted to name, thank you for sharing what you shared around, like the marginal, and I don't know if you use that word, but, and strangeness. Like to me, I love, that's something that I really gravitate towards, is strangeness and monstrosity in particular, and like learning from what is seen as monstrous or other or mutations or anything that's like other with a capital O. Anything that anyone or anything, I'm using the word thing on purpose, like that's othered and becomes a thing somehow different. And before I share a little bit more about that, I wanted to mention that I am just coming from a fast. I was in the desert in Utah for a 96-hour fast not too long ago. And I'm still in this like liminal space of transitioning back into words. Because I was by myself, quote unquote. That's not true, actually. I just wasn't around other human company. But I was surrounded by other beings, namely, cryptobiotic soil is one of my favorite kin, which is a desert, like a desert soil crust that's made up of several biological communities, and I'm forgetting all of them right now. One of them is fungi.
Bacteria.
Cyano or cyanobacteria, algae, and someone else I'm forgetting. But it's either 3 or 4 organisms. And that's someone who's very othered and marginal, often because they're very much invisible to many people. They're this like, what creates the structure of soil in deserts, instead of it just being like blown away, the desert soil and sand, they are the ones that create these underground structures of filaments, I think that's what it's called, networks, where seeds of certain plants can actually take root and create life or more life, I guess, in the desert. So I got to dream with them for several nights. Cryptobiotic soil, they're one of my biggest teachers. And they're someone who's often very othered. And I think one other thing that I wanted to mention regarding that, with monstrosity in particular, is just really learning from wanting to learn from what is the ecological, or I don't know if that's even the right word, but what is the momentum towards othering, period. And like, what is that actually reflecting within ourselves, or whoever is doing that othering? Because I don't escape from that. And I don't always strive to necessarily like the other, I don't always strive to belong necessarily either. I think the other is actually really sacred. So how can we actually like not desecrate like this capital O other, but actually be in relationship with one another, whether it's like the marginal fungi, or if it's whoever else, like the queer penguins, or I'm not sure, like just that's just something that I've been really with the desert in prayer this last few nights until I came over here very quickly. So that's just a little bit about how I guess I would respond to that question, and not respond because it's kind of like an open query or inquiry that I have.
Query.
Yes.
I knew you were going to do it.
Sorry.
Thank you. I wasn't going to catch that. I'm a little slow right now. I'm moving at cryptobiotic speed. So, thank you.
Beautiful. When I look back on my life, really, there have been 2 overarching themes, and that has been nature and queerness. And I think for most of my life, I felt those were two things that were in some way incompatible or living in a binary within myself. And it wasn't really until working on Atmos that I started to see these things braided together. You know, nature and biology, for so much of my life, I'm used to these things being weaponized against queer people. And we see the same patterns repeated, right? We have seen in the past homosexuality is unnatural. And then, of course, so much came to light around the fact that there are thousands of other species that exhibit homosexuality. Now we're seeing the same thing. Transness is unnatural, despite the fact that there are so many species outside of the human that challenge our notions of binary sex and transcend it altogether. And so it's the same cyclical patterns, but what I've really come to in trying to answer this question for myself is, what is queerness if not another word for wild? That untamable part of us that is determined to grow no matter what, to thrive despite the environment that it's in, to adapt and change and grow and evolve and to be itself. When I think about the natural world, I think about every organism simply seeking to grow into itself, to thrive. And we are not exempt from that as humans. And I will never understand what makes some people try to stop that from happening in other people, why we others. But it's a question I'm continuously seeking to answer, and it's a for me a reclamation. I think understanding my queerness as something feral, something that will not be tamed, and something that will change and grow and teach me if I can surrender to it. So that's where I'm at with it.
Wow. Those were all three very beautiful responses. Thank you. Before I respond to those, I realized that I forgot to say that there should be note cards available to everyone. And at the end of our conversation, we're going to be doing a Q&A. So if you at any point have a idea for a question, just go ahead and write it down and we'll collect it at the end. And we'll also have a chance to speak your question with your voice as well. So multi-genre Q&A experience. I really love what everyone's touching on with this idea of the other and the strange, which is obviously a very queer idea. And I wrote down something that you said, Patty, about how community is built through transactions of things that are not quite the same. I think that's really beautiful. And I feel like so much of queerness is attuning yourself to the strange and feeling at home in it, but also like, I find that difference is there. It's a very sacred space, as you said, Pinar. It's like a very reverent thing to recognize that difference. And I was curious for each of you if there was a point where you started to see nature as a queer space.
I'll go. So I would say that I was able to look back on my life and see that I had that sort of innate awareness all along, but I didn't necessarily have the language for it as a young child. So the safety I found in the company of all of these other creatures was very much directly related to my queer experience, but I didn't necessarily name it as such at the time. I over the course of my adulthood becoming a scientist, I found that there was a period in graduate school where I was sort of coming out, even like kind of like very incrementally. I came out like very slowly and like gradually in phases, and then backtracked and then went other directions. It was a very non-linear coming out journey for me. But part of that was, I don't know how it would have gone actually if I hadn't been studying mushrooms, for two reasons. One is that my experience consuming psychedelic mushrooms was a really important experience for me in terms of medicinally, in terms of therapeutically, and on sort of understanding my position in the world and sort of how it related to complex trauma and sort of my relationship to the earth, right? So there was this healing work that was being done through the consumption of fungi, but then fungi were also this medicine in terms of teaching me like how I could be my full self, full of contradiction, full of mistakes, full of imperfection, and to be like really amphibious and slippery and not actually fully commit to anything identity wise, right? And that this way of sort of like moving and slipping and sliding and like retreating and growing and all of these things were shown to me by fungi. So I loved, when I think about fungi, you know, they're right for metaphor, they're right for symbolism, but I prefer, and Pinar just used this word too, the word teacher. And I think symbolism is a little bit thin. It's a little bit consumptive, but teachers are complex, and they're imperfect, and they're agents unto themselves, right? So I saw fungi as teachers that were like, but as I was studying them biologically, I was learning about my own queerness, and then vice versa. The more I learned about my own queerness, the different sorts of questions I started to ask about the actual science behind these organisms. Why do people in Western European, Euro-American culture find them disgusting? Why do people laugh every time I tell them I'm a mycologist? Why do people think mushrooms are just going to kill them? Like, like why? And so that's actually kind of a philosophical question or a philosophical rabbit hole that I went down. And these like the sort of track of queerness and mycology were mutually reinforcing one another with fungi as these teachers along the way. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting, that question. It was. Can you actually repeat it one more time?
Yeah, of course. Was there like a turning point when you started to think of nature as a queer space?
Because I think that implies that maybe it wasn't at one point.
Yeah,
in your mind.
In my mind.
Yeah.
My mind. Sorry. Words.
Yeah.
Never apologize.
And what?
I said never apologize.
But yeah, and I think I'm not sure if that ever was not for me. And not to make that better or anything, like, or just a different experience, or everyone has different experiences. And yeah, and I could just relate a lot to what you're sharing about amphibiousness too. And like, yeah, and as someone who is, so I'm on the autism spectrum, and neurodivergent, and that really informs how my experience of queerness and my gender. Hence, there's a word called neuroqueer that kind of means that your queerness is just inextricably connected to your experience with being neurodivergent. That feels just as true as my experience being an indigiqueer person. So a person, an indigiqueer, so someone who's indigenous, and my indigeneity really, and my queerness and sexuality being really like situated in place and really ecologically informed. And when I was growing up, with my relationships, with my companionships, my more than human teachers, and it was really pathologized, actually, quite a bit, very violently, as someone who was more on like the so-called nonverbal like spectrum of things, and with autism, and was coded as schizophrenic for having relationships with like trees and just like non-human. Somehow that was considered crazy. And so I often am so curious about like what animisms or ways of relating to the world and seeing the world as animate and alive are pathologized, and are, colonized, or attempted colonization, because indigenous ontologies and indigenous animism still thrive and exist. So it's really interesting to have that question, because I just keep thinking about how much I found refuge with my companionships with my more than human kin, as teachers, again, with agency within, them having their own sovereignty and not seeing them as an oracle to get something from, right? Which there's, again, we all have, not we all, I don't want to we everyone, but a lot of people have like a disturbed or interrupted relationship, like attachment to place, and like ecologically speaking, like just there's like a lot of people do have interrupted attachment, or insecure attachment to place. And so I think it does make sense to like try to figure, there's like clunkiness to figuring it out, right? Yeah. It's not to like make it wrong that we're trying to like, ask a question, and maybe something like the mushroom will tell us something about ourselves. There's nothing wrong with that. That's an attempt for connection. And so I think it's really interesting for me to consider that question, because it inevitably like brings in like psychiatric abolition for me, and like in terms of who do we call crazy for seeing the world as alive, and then who gets book deals, for seeing the world as alive, historically speaking and also currently speaking. I think that's what I'll answer for now. Just more questions.
I've got more of them.
Yeah. I love what you shared around your diagnosis and your relationship with trees, because it reminds me, I'm reading the book right now, The Light Eaters, which is all about plant consciousness, and the author Zoe sort of asked the question at one point, why are we, in referencing AI, they asked the question, why are we so quick and ready to ascribe consciousness to machines, but we can't even bring ourselves to think of other beings as conscious, think of plants as conscious? And speaking of plant consciousness, in answering this question, I wasn't really expecting this to come up for me, and I've never really talked about it publicly, but I was also in a space working with psychedelics. This was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I was in a very different time in my life, and very dark time in a lot of ways. And I went into that experience with one intention, which was just, I wanted to see myself. And that was like my prayer for the ceremony and for the weekend. And the medicine I was working with really did that, really showed me like this person who is sitting here before you. And I have watched in the time since when I started medically transitioning, I have watched my reflection change in the mirror. I've watched myself become that person that I saw 4 years ago. And it's been one of the most wild experiences of my life. And to me, that space, that circle, was one of the first times I really fully embraced nature as a queer space, because I thought, here is a conversation I'm having with another species, a conversation I'm having with a plant medicine that is literally encouraging my growth and my embodiment and my becoming. And I thought how natural that was, and how sacred it was, outside of the confines of all of the struggles that we see within society in terms of discouraging, in my specific case, transitioning and having access to healthcare. And yeah, that experience, I think, for me, really rooted it in my body, that nature is queer, and that my queerness has always been intertwined with my love of nature.
I love that. And I love this theme or this thread of nature being a teacher, whether that's you taking a psychedelic fungus. It's not fungus, just
that
fungus.
one's definitely wrong. Yeah.
Got it.
Fungus. Yeah.
Or doing a ceremony in a natural space. Like I think about what you were saying in response to the first question, Pinar, of, I guess some of us think about going into nature as a space to be alone, but you are never alone. You are surrounded by other species and soil crusts and plants and little, spiderlings in the air, which is maybe exciting or maybe horrifying to you. And if it's horrifying, you don't have to think about it. But I guess thinking about what all of you have been saying, I wanted to ask about what the role of ritual is for each of you in terms of building your connection with nature or healing something within yourself.
Yeah. So I would say that I'll share just two different rituals. The first is, to speak about it briefly, because it's just pulling on that psychedelic thread, is that I do typically consume mushrooms like once a year to clean out the pipes. But mostly alone, mostly in the forest, in spots that I've visited repeatedly, places in the forest that I know really, really well. Like typically that I could navigate almost like in the dark, and where I always know like sort of who in the multi-species sense will be there, and who I know who will be my support system there. And that helps me a lot in terms of navigating grief, navigating change, and finding those core parts of myself that are the constant, while I also am shedding and molting and shape-shifting. So that's an important part of my life. And I've done that for I don't remember how old I am. A long time, like 50, I guess maybe 17 years or something. I've been doing that. Yeah. And then the other ritual though, and this is something that I think I always I teach this in my classes and to students, but it's finding your spot, finding a place outside somewhere that you go. It doesn't have to be pristine, quote unquote wilderness, quote unquote, because those are really complicated constructs. But it's about, setting yourself up for as many species encounters as is accessible to you. So whether it's an urban park, or whether if you're a person who can't even leave your home, it's looking out the window. They're just going again and again and again and again. And one thing that cannot be forced really is the longitudinal relationship to place that just takes time. So giving a place the gift of your time again and again and again and again for ideally years and years and years. You go and you sit and you watch and you listen and you smell and you use all your senses. Actually, your touch, taste. Smell is such a good one because of its connection with memory, and it's such an intimate sense. And you start to see who lives here as well, and you notice that your body starts to calibrate to the sort of pace of the spot. And I also have ADHD and I'm I guess a neurodivergent person as well. And for me, I can't do any sort of sitting meditation, it's like literal torture. but somehow being outside and being in, maybe even literally crawling around, picking up sticks, breaking little leaves and sniffing them. There's something that's stimulating about it, but calming. And it's this perfect, combination for those things. So you calibrate your sort of internal processes with the space around you. And over time, you'll realize that space is no longer like a space as it's not like an open, it's not like a room. It's like a person. You give it personhood by going and being attentive. So that act of so as your point about from Zoe's Schlanger's book, about how are we so willing to ascribe consciousness to AI? When you give that sort of attention to other species, they I think you are sort of accepting their personhood as well. So and that becomes a friendship. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think there's so many rituals or ceremonies, but I'm just thinking, I think in particular, of fasting right now, but not so much the specifics of that, more of just how that has been like a marker for me, or like a way of checking in with, like dropping into my own kind of like the story of who I am in relationship to place. And I was really grateful for the story that you shared around, what you just shared about seeing yourself 4 years ago. And my first fast was, I believe, about 10 years ago. And a lot of it was around my own, I call it like a expansion, or like a gender expansion. Or I tend to refer to it like, just the expansion of my internal landscape, and really starting to work with like testosterone, and and also, was just like praying into like how I really wanted to be in, my story, my own story of like being embodied as a shapeshifter, being like a liminal person between with multiple genders, many genders, and in so many ways all the pronouns are like actually correct now. I think before it was like very specific for me, and I was like, no, it's only these pronouns, and now I'm like, actually all of them are true. Like, just mix it up in a sentence before me, because that's even more accurate. Just multiplicity abound. And so I think one of the things that I feel has been really supportive for me is to really, especially with my experience of gender expansion and what people, like being trans, is bringing those conversations out to the land is so important for me. I think sometimes for me, when it can be really, when I don't do that, I am concerned for myself. I really need to check in with my teachers and my community, my kin that are other than human, and be like, are you seeing me change? Or I'm seeing you change too. And like, it's like this mutual adoration and witnessing. And that's also why I love wildlife tracking, which is another kind of like a ceremonial practice of mine. And Lifeway is, it's so intimate to be able to see these intimate stories of other beings on the land and how they interact with one another. And the relationships that they have with this plant that they love, like this porwheel, this is one of my favorite birds, where I live in this canyon that I live with. They have this very particular plant called Ceanosis that they love roosting under. And I never knew that until I just started noticing their stories. And what a beautiful offering to be able to gift our attention in that way, like not only to non-humans, but also to each other. And to me, that is very like a queering, and also like, I've recently been sitting with like how nothing is casual. And
such my vibe.
Well, yeah, me too, actually.
Extremely chalant.
And
so chalant.
Just being with adoration, intimacy, and letting encounters change us, because that's really what, to me, like Nothing is Casual is about, and what wildlife tracking continually teaches me every day. So, yeah.
I love what you both shared. Thank you. when I think about rituals for connecting to nature and my queer understandings of nature, it really, for me, comes down to the newsletter that I write, the overview. So I write it every week, and it's always on a Thursday. And so much of this weekly ritual for myself has been about both getting closer to and transcending myself, or my understanding of myself. And it's really been a process of trying to figure out how, through writing and through writing about nature specifically, I can share something personal with the world that is not about me. And nature is sort of the river through which that happens. And I think I've written somewhere around like 240 editions now. And what I have been continuously surprised by is how much they have taught me how much we all have in common. I'll use an example. One time I had an experience with some strangers on the street that really left me feeling shaken, and it led me to reflecting on vulnerability. And I started doing research around what some of the most vulnerable creatures are on the planet. And one thing led to another, led me eventually to frogs, and specifically their skin and how porous it is and how they breathe through their skin, which is so miraculous to me. And also they're able to do so many other cool things with their skin, like secrete poison, depending on the species, etc. But that to me was this beautiful lesson in vulnerability is also a superpower. And I ended up writing about that and not really my experience at all. And I had so many people reach out about that one and about connecting with the idea of vulnerability and the fact that it is just, we are all vulnerable every time we leave the house, every time we don't leave the house. It's part of what it means to be alive. And to me, it's this constant reminder of how much we all have in common. And to me, that's what nature is. It's what we all have in common. And that, for me, is queer inherently, because when I think about queerness, I think about challenging our notions of identity and what it really is to be an individual, right? I'm Willow, but I'm also over 1,000 different species that live within my body and allow me to thrive and function. And I'm also me, and I'm also part of a community. And if we extend that thinking outward, the queer community as a whole is also a body, one that we are all part of. And if you extend that further, we are a species that we are all part of. And so I've been very grateful to have this means of practicing a reminder of that understanding in my life.
That's so beautiful. And I love, the reminder that we are individuals, but we also are filled with bacteria, and our faces are covered with face mites, which are also a part of this panel just as much as we are. I'm
really going to sit with that one for a little while.
You can look at them if you put a tape on your forehead and then you put it under a microscope. And dogs have them too. But I really relate to what you're saying, Willow, about, trying to find that point of commonality with even like the strangest species. I write a lot about the deep sea, which feels like a place that is so separate from our experience. And, you think about these creatures as, living in a space that would be so hostile to us. And so the things that they need to live couldn't possibly be the same things that we need to live. And it's, the deep sea is currently a space that's very threatened by deep sea mining for rare minerals. And there are so many species down there that we're still discovering, and so many species, like there is this organism called the xenophyophore, which is the largest single-celled organism. And it looks like a ball of snot or a ball of poop. So not much to look at, but I look at this creature that is so unlike me, and I remember, right, that we all have a common ancestor, and we all have this shared lineage, and we've all found a little spot of earth to call our own, and we all depend on the planet, functioning and being in this harmony that it's been in for a long time. I think this is going to be our last question, and then we are going to pivot to Q&A, so think of your questions. I'm just going to sort of combine these because I think they're kind of related, but I'm curious to hear all of your thoughts on how we are entangled with nature. And I'm curious if there are ways that you see yourself sort of transgressing the boundaries that we set up between human and animal, or human and non-human, any of those sort of false boundaries.
I'll go.
We just look to you every time.
So I guess I'm going to pull on something you just said, Sabrina, which is evolution, right? That we all beings share a common ancestor, a universal common ancestor. Life started on this planet a few billion years ago, and it's been this continuous, long, unbroken chain of cellular memory, really, that has unfurled all of this, all of these threads, right, that are connected, and we are so obsessed with sort of human exceptionalism, right? The idea that humans are somehow set apart from the rest, and this idea has roots in it's still, even though it's been scientifically disproven that humans are somehow biologically unique from other. I mean, of course, we have every species has its own unique combination of attributes, but there's nothing like more evolved about humans, right? If you exist right now on Earth, then you're equally as evolved as anything else that exists here on Earth. Evolution isn't about like a destination; it's a process of change. And that change happens by way of mutation. Mutation on this little kind of combination of information that's like a string of code, right? And the code is like your DNA, and it's like moving, it's like reproducing itself, it's continuing itself, and there's some sort of like vital energy that exists within all species. Every species is sort of intrinsically motivated to continue passing that code along, and for that information to sort of move between us. And so that's something that binds all of us in this very like material way, right? That we're very literally these other things that have our ancestors that came before us, not just human, but pre-human, bacterial, like we are like our cells. Not only do we have other species within us, but our cells themselves are made up of symbiotic events, bacteria that combined with other bacteria and became multicellular. And that's still like the cellular constitution of our bodies. Like we're truly, literally like made up of other things. And so when we've been really hell bent on creating this othering, creating this distance, positioning, in the history of scientific thought, it was about, positioning humans as closer to God on this great chain of being, right? There was, before an evolution, scientists thought about like how to hierarchically arrange organisms, and those at the bottom, like the fungi, the algae, they were further from God. They're lesser beings. And even though we've, again, scientifically have debunked that idea through, and of course, other cultures around the world, operating outside of Western institutions, have long known this, as that there is this more horizontal way of understanding the world. These species they're different. We're not saying that they're the same, but they're not. One is not like better than the other, right? But we've been really bent on creating this distance, so that when you create distance between something, that's an act of like, it's a way of dominating, right? It's a way, if you create distance, then you can, in that space, you can transact harm because you don't feel like it's part of you anymore. So if you create that space, that's where you then are permitting yourself to violate, to destroy. And so it's through that intellectual maneuver that we create hierarchy. And we do this within the human species and across to other species as well. It's the same logic, even though it seems a little icky to say like our subjugation of nature is the same as like racial subjugation. It's the same set of it's the same maneuver. It's the same logical, it's the same, like you do it the same way, right? You say that there's a difference that's not really there, so you can create space, so you can transact harm and feel less guilty about it, right? I did lose track of the question. But yeah.
Oh,
okay.
but I mean, that was great. Yeah.
Can we just
Thank you. So I'll wrap it up there. I don't know.
Perfect.
Yeah. exactly.
I love wandering with you and your
Yeah.
thoughts. It's so good.
I'm like, take me anywhere. I'm on for it.
Thank you.
So funny now that I want you to ask the question again.
Yeah, just are there ways that you see yourself sort of transgressing these false boundaries, or ways that you try to be entangled with nature?
Did you want to add anything else?
I guess just collapsing that space. I like to think about myceliating. So that space that we created, like to myceliate it. So in fungi, mycelium is that cobwebby network of cells that sort of moves through bodies, and it performs sex, and it's digesting, and it's traveling. And so to myceliate is to bring that tissue in, to flood it with sensation, right? So myceliating the emotional distance between me and you, between me and oak, between me and blue jay, right? That's a way to myceliate that space. Is something that I think about. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, I love asking for questions multiple times because it just lands differently
Yeah.
every single time. Like it's just like an encounter. Every single question, every single time. Is different. So thank you. Yeah, I think I'm so glad you brought the word porosity in, or porous. I relate so much to the permeably skinned ones. The ones like like frogs and salamanders. And I think something that I've been really sitting with, or I've been with lately, is really being like welcoming my porosity, and just like how sensitive I am. And I think a lot of people are really sensitive, actually. And so I've been actually, one of my dear mentors recently was like, you kind of have like, okay, so backtrack. They were seeing me track. We were in the desert in Utah, and you know, I'm just literally just witnessing, just like seeing a wood rat that was feeding on a prickly pear cactus. It was like a little feeding sign. And when I saw this little sign of these little teeth marks that were just like this incisors, this little cute little rat teeth, like carving into the prickly pear pad, but also gingerly removing the spines and gently placing them on the ground. I didn't see the being, I just saw the sign. I squealed. I was just so excited that I nearly ripped my pants. That happens because I get really excited about my kin and seeing the ones that I love. And she was just like, how is that? How does that feel in your body? Like you just see, you look so overwhelmed with adoration. And I'm like, that's a really good question. And I sat with it, and I was like, it literally feels like all of my like I feel inside out. Like I'm just like, all my nerves are exposed. And it's overwhelming, actually. But I don't really know if there's any other way that I would have it. Like I want to feel like relationship and be impacted and changed by it. And I know there's uncomfortable ones too. Not every encounter is a wood rat, but or beautiful fungi kin. And I just feel like there's just such a gift in that, that I think everyone has access to. And to me, porosity feels really similar to queerness too, and wildness, like almost like synonymous with each other for me. And I'm not sure if I can like say more to that at the current moment, like to flesh that out, but that was really up for me in the last 4 nights when I was out in the desert. And yeah, just really letting myself be with an exposed nervous system. And that we're all exposed nervous in our own way, you know, and like how can we like myceliate, you know, across these like so-called distances. Again, while honoring the sacred other, like, and not just like trying to like be one, like, and it like merge, but to really honor that what is the word that I'm trying to find? The ecotone between people, because people are places too. Like each one of us are places. So how can we also honor us as walking places? Yeah, so I guess I'll share that. There was something else I was going to share, and I'm spacing.
That was beautiful. So if
Yeah.
it comes to you later, we can come back. Yeah.
Can we hear it for walking places?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that.
So when I first met my partner, she shared with me that coming into her queerness is what saved her life, literally. And so over the course of her life, she has come to define or understand queerness as a proximity to aliveness for her, to being alive. And, you use the word transgression in this question, right? I think so.
Yeah.
Let's go with that. You use the word transgression in this question, and the root word trans actually means to get across or beyond. And for me, so much of coming into myself has been both an experience of getting closer to myself and also everything else. And that, for me, looks like what I was sharing around my writing practice, around understanding what we all have in common, but also a sense of embodiment, of actually being here and being present in the world, of no longer being in a state of dissociation, of separation. And that's really what transition, in my experience, is really about. And there's something, and I love what you shared around wanting to feel it all in relationship, because there's something about being here. It's very hard to be here partially. And I think when we're here, when we're really present and we're really present to life, and we're really embodying ourselves fully in the world, it's very hard to turn ourselves off from feeling or being in experience and in relationship with everything else. And so I feel deeply myself, I feel deeply human, and I also feel deeply everything else. I feel deeply animal, I feel deeply alive. And to me, that really is intertwined with being queer.
I love everything that was just shared. And I guess the only way that I can think to sort of marry all of those things, just thinking about being walking places, thinking about, I guess, the grace that you can give with just by paying attention to something and by being slow with it and allowing those things to grow. I think about sloths, which are often referred to as sort of like walking islands, because they move so slowly that they are a great ecosystem for algae and moss that just like live in their fur, because it's almost like living in a tree. Like they're moving so slowly, they're very rarely disturbed. And I think that if we can try to be more like that and to give our attention to things and to be slow, what algae could we grow? But now it's time for Q&A. So I will collect any note cards if there are any note cards. But while I'm waiting for that, if anyone has a question, you can just stand up and speak. And I just ask that we keep the questions short, and then maybe the responses short so we can get through a lot of them. Does anyone have a question? Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing everything. I really resonate with everything you talked about and with this critical to me. So given that nature and we connected to that are kind of in trouble, how can we use queerness and queer identity to shift that? Or, that was to pay attention to.
So I'd say that one of the things that one of my favorite lessons from queerness is like the plasticity of like relationship types, right? This is not obviously true for everyone, but just in my experience, there's like there are so many ways of being in relationship, and in queer community, and one, like not everything has to like go through a particular trajectory to be like a beautiful, important like relationship. And I think that there's something there for to think in ways of thinking about nature as well, like nature, other species as one of like the great loves of your life, right? That you can be, that these are, that you dedicate yourself to to nature, to a particular species or a particular place with the same sort of like enthusiasm and like commitment as you might to a human person, like human relationship. And I think also just sort of like showing us, like queerness shows us like all of these different ways of orienting towards one another. All of them are like generative and different. And I think just sort of realizing that we can do the same with non-humans is a way of sort of like, maybe like, what if you thought about like letting that feeling that you might have for a person like enter your heart when you're thinking about a forest or, you know, and I don't know how easy that is for other people. But that's something that I've like thought about over time, and I feel like have been able to sort of genuinely embody, which is like a genuinely like a great, you know, like it's incomprehensible to lose these things to me. Like it would be like, you know, so I don't know, just a gesture towards your question, I guess.
I have a,
Oh,
sorry. I was just gonna say like a quick response to what you just shared, or addition, which is what I totally forgot in my introduction to name that my this creek in particular, who's my soulmate and my love. And when I first met which is my spouse and the other co-founder of Queer Nature, 10 years ago or 11 years ago, I told them, I was like, yeah, so my primary partnership is with this creek. And they were just like, oh. And I was like, and then they met and they were like, oh. And I was like, yeah. And so, yeah, so I just like wanting to share that, like as like a story and just as lived experience. And thanks for bringing that in. Yeah, question.
Thanks for your question.
that's beautiful. I love that creek as a member of a throuple is really important. I was just going to briefly say there's this great book coming out soon called Rachel Carson and the Power of Queer Love, which I couldn't believe that it took me so many years to realize that Rachel Carson was very queer and had a great love. And I think this book reminded me that to me, queerness is a lot about like, and both imagining a better world, but also demanding it and finding ways to articulate that both as they affect queer and trans people, but also as they affect nature. So I recommend that book. But I'm going to switch to, unless Willow, do you have anything to add? I'm going to do a note card question. Shifting focus slightly from our individual relationship with nature, how do each of you foster a sense of community with other humans around a shared joy in the natural world?
I'm not going to start this one.
You've done the work.
Yeah.
Patty is protesting. You know, I spoke to this a little bit, but for me, really writing has been a space of creating that shared relationship. I think also something I'm really passionate about is breaking down the binary of cities and nature.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many queer people have been relegated to cities because that's traditionally where we have found each other. It's where we have found community. And I think the idea that nature is othered, is somewhere else from wherever we are now, is part of the separation. It's part of the binary that we are attempting to overcome in returning to a collective understanding of nature. And so practicing being in any queer space, even when we are in a city, when we are anywhere, and understanding it as being in an ecosystem and being in nature has been a really big practice for me in my life. I don't know if that answered the question, but
yeah, it did to me. I love the city and nature. Just disintegrating that binary is very important. Yeah, and I would say for me, I think engaging with people, supporting curiosity, I think is really important for me as like a community practice, like how can we create spaces that are like, just like nurture curiosity, which is like what creates space for, I think, creates a surface area for enchantment and awe. And really, because I feel like that feels so important to me, to see people come alive when their curiosity is nurtured, especially within a community context, especially within a queer community, can be in the natural, like, whether it's like looking at birds in a city, which I love, or looking at like nests in cities is always really fun, or the night sky. And just being curious about each other's stories and also the stories on the land. I'm always obsessed with talking about tracking, but less about interpretation and more like, here's an answer to your, like let's obliterate mystery right now. Like, it's not that, it's more like, okay, can we be in mystery together right now? Like, actually, like together, like I am your companion in mystery. And that feels like such an important practice for the times we're in, too, of just like, how can we learn how to encounter mystery together and be curious and cultivate curiosity together, as a community practice, and widen and, with our species, yes, curiosity about our own species, but also like widen it to other species, and what people might consider inanimate objects, which I don't understand the idea of inanimacy, but, and that's okay. But just curiosity. I don't know. I think that's really big for me right now in particular.
You can go to the next one.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, how do you navigate the personal connection that you're describing, to the political issues, social justice, or the issues that we're dealing with that require moving us beyond personal, small communities?
So yeah, I think as a scientist, a lot of scientists have struggled for a while knowing like how dire climate change is, for example, right? And how frustrating it has been to be like, well, here's like what's happening, and yet people seem unmoved, or people are moved, but governments are not. And I think part of it is that the abstraction of climate change, right? So like we're talking about parts per million, carbon in the atmosphere, or how many degrees centigrade the Earth will change on average. And these things are like hard to like, it's like, okay, I mean, that for most people, that's just like information, right? So I do think that the personal, not to hyper individualize the experience of nature, but I do think it is important that people have like an emotional stake when they think about like when they think about climate change, that it's not just about like these like facts and figures, but it's about like our home, and people can use those words, but it's really important that when I'm educating, when I'm teaching, I'm thinking about making it really personal, because if it's not personal, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, so there has to be something, and we're living in a time where most people have been forcibly displaced from their indigenous homelands, or they're, the descendants of settlers, or they're descendants of people who've colonized. And so there's been this great severing of attachment, right, to place, and we've been pulling on that. And so people need to recommit to forming that attachment. It's not going to replace, there's no replacement for like thousands of years of relationship to place, right? But you can, like in the book, for example, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she's a botanist and she was a member of the Potawatomi Nation. I also had the privilege of her being on my PhD committee. And she talks in her book about becoming native to place, which is sort of a gesture towards like, being a steward, right? How do you steward the land that you find yourself on now, regardless, however you got here? And that I do think that there's a really intimate connection between sort of these colonial forces that have moved and relocated and dislocated and destroyed so much, and sort of resisting that through practices of deepening connection to place. So I do think that I don't want to I think you're absolutely right to point out, like, how do we connect this? And I do think that that's where we should all be sort of keeping our orientation toward these bigger systems and problems. But I do see sort of that the first important part is like helping people to form that connection so that these abstract ideas become personal, become intimate, become like it's your skin in the game. And it becomes your flesh. So yeah. I think that's, yeah. Mm-hmm.
If I can just pull on the thread you mentioned around creating an emotional connection, I think that really is how we make the political personal. I think that we speak about the climate crisis as if it's the disease as opposed to a symptom of a deeper disconnect. And that disconnect, that separation, well, I think about what is an antithesis to separation. And so much of that to me is love. Love is relationship. Love is connection. And it feels relevant to me here because who you love isn't all of queerness. It's not all of what makes us queer, but it's a part of it. And I have found in my own life that numbers don't necessarily change people. Scaring people doesn't necessarily change them. Shaming people doesn't necessarily change them. But I do think reminding people that they are in love with this earth does change people, because I do think that people are motivated to act on behalf of what they love, to protect what they love. And so I think in our everyday lives, the more we can help people become re-enchanted and to fall in love with all of the other beings that we share this planet with and the planet itself, I think that is intertwined with how we make the political personal again.
I mean, I think that's just a beautiful place to end. Thank you all so much. Can we get a round of applause for our wonderful panelists? Please buy their books, support their work, read their work. I hope we can all leave this space and myceliate in the ways that we can. I know that this conversation has really, encouraged me to expand my surface area of enchantment. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.